In this video, I want to create a function which takes a text string, extracts all the numbers, and then sums them up. I'll be using a recursive function to do this because I wanted to try it out. Before getting further, I want to discuss what a recursive function is. Essentially, it's a function that calls itself. The way I think of it is that it's basically a do-while loop, which will keep looping as long as the condition is met, and you need to provide a condition that breaks out of it. The simple example of a recursive function is the factorial function. In Excel, you can just write fact and then 5, which gives 120, which is 5 times 4 times 3 times 3 times 2 times 1. In other words, this is a function that takes n, in this case 5, and multiplies it by n minus 1, then multiplies that with n minus 2, minus 3, minus 1, until this becomes 0. I can break this calculation down into its constituent steps. Instead of saying 5 times 4, I actually want to say it should take the above value and then minus 1, which is functionally the same, but it's the principle. Because this loop will keep running as long as the value is not equal to 0. And what I want to do then is to take the value that is above itself and then multiply it by the number below. In the first step, it's just 5 times 1. In the next loop, it's 5, the previous value, multiplied by n minus 1, and then it will keep going. But then here, when it reaches 1, well, a number multiplied by 1 is the same, and a number multiplied by 0 gives 0, so I want to stop whenever the value n is equal to 0. Otherwise, it should keep multiplying it by itself, minus 1. In order to create my function in Power Query, I want to break it into multiple steps in order to make it easier for the developer to see what's going on. So I can start out by making a normal query, which will then give me 3 functions. I first want to take the text in the data column and then remove anything that isn't a number. So if I copy this value, and then we can experiment on it. That means the first step is a function that takes an argument. That argument is the input text, and I want to output the actual function, which is to select only those characters that are numbers. This will act upon my text, and I only want to select those characters that fall between 0 and 9. And this is text 0 through 9. Which means I can actually add here that it should be type text if I wanted to. I can then try it out because I know that I want to remove the ABC portion, which gives me 1, 2, 3, exactly what I want. The second step is then to take my clean text, and then I want to say how long is this text, because that tells me how many times I have to loop, which means my second function will also take a text as an input, which will then simply be text length. And again, I don't actually need these functions as the independent steps, but it's to make it easier to break down the function I want to create. Which means in the first step, I turn ABC123 into 123, and then I get the length, and then of course I input this as a number and not as a text. That will give me 3. The actual difficult portion comes next, but first I need to remember to change my names, and I can't change the name of the source step under the applied steps. I have to go into advanced editor. So this will be my clean text function, and this will then be my length function. This third function is the actual meat and potatoes of the overall function, which is going to take 2 arguments, the outputs of these 2 functions, and then it's going to output something. So it will take my clean, which will be the output of the clean text function, and my length, which will be the output of my length function. And what I like doing first, if you have to do a recursive function or a do-while loop, is to always make sure that you have the breakout condition first. Otherwise, it's going to keep looping forever. Just as with the factorial example, I can say that I want to stop looping whenever my length is equal to 0. That way, this will be my iterator. And in the case of the text ABC123, my length will start out being 3, and then I'm going to reduce this by 1 each time, and then eventually it will be 0, at which point I break out. So I will say, if my length is equal to 0, then I want to return 0, else I want to actually do the function. If you want to create a factorial function using a recursive call, then you'd want to say that this should be 1, meaning that if my length isn't 0, then I should do whatever is in this line. I want to start out by extracting a number from text, because the output of my clean text is a text string, and I want to get a number. And then I want to use the text middle function, because I actually want to loop backwards. When I have the text 1, 2, 3, I actually want to start out by taking the 3, and then the 2, and then the 1. I could do it the other way around, but this way I can start out my function with my length, which would be 3, and then keep going backwards until I hit 0. In my opinion, this is the simpler solution, meaning I want to extract the middle of my clean text, and then my length minus 1. And this is because in Power Query with this function, my start is to the left of the value I want to grab. If I want the first text character, I would say that the start is 0 and the count is 1. That way I will grab the first item. In my case, my length will be 3 at the start, which means it's going to start after the third character, which means it won't grab anything. That's why I have to say -1. And then I want to grab one character. And then in order to do a recursive call, I have to say that this will grab 3 in the first loop, and then I want to call the function again. And right now my step is called custom1, so that's what I have to write. And in order to do the recursive call, I use the @ sign and then the name of the function, which in this case is custom1. And this time I still want to input the same clean text. I don't change that part, but instead of my length being the output of this length function, it's instead the input for this function call, but it's -1. And this is where it gets a bit trippy. But what this means is that when I call this function the first time, my length is equal to 3. And then when I recursively call it again, I say that my length should now be equal to 2. And then it's going to be 1, and then it's going to be 0. And when it's 0, it will just give me 0. Meaning the first time I call this, I get 3. The second time I get it, I get 3 plus 2. Then I get 3 plus 2 plus 1. Then 3 plus 2 plus 1 plus 0. The current problem with this function is that I have 2 arguments, and that's actually not what I want. When I call it inside of my actual table, I want to only have 1 argument, because if I try to call it now by invoking a custom function, I have a custom function called query2 in this case, but this takes 2 arguments. And I actually want to extract the length based not on my clean, but based on the cleaned version, which means that my length should actually not grab the value in data, it should grab the value that I get out of my clean. So I can't call it this way. What I can instead do is to create a last function, because again, when I actually want to call this query as a function, it will always call the last step in my query. I need to make sure that my last step both takes the input argument that I wanted to take and produces the result. And this function does not currently do that. And what I can do then, actually I should test this before I go further, just so you can see it. So the output of my clean would be not ABC123, but 123. And it's going to fail right now because it thinks that this is a number, but I'll fix that afterwards. And my length would then be 3, and then I put quotation marks around to make it text. And then this will give 6, because again, it will grab 3, add that to 2, add that to 1, and then add it to 0, and then it's done. Then I should also rename this. Meaning all I have to do is to make sure that my last step calls these 3 functions in the order I want them to. And I need to make sure it's a function that takes 1 input argument. So I will also use, actually I won't call it my text because that's what I've used in these functions. So I'll just say my input, and that should go towards. And then I'm going to use variables, and here's again why these 2 first functions aren't actually necessary, but I chose to split it up this way for ease of understanding. I'll create 2 variables saying that my clean should then be equal to my clean text function, which takes my input as its argument. And then I want another variable called my length, which is likewise equal to the length function, but not using my input, it should use the output of my clean. And I want to use these variables inside then a function called toSumNum, the previous step, where I then input my clean. And then I can try doing ABC123, which gives me 6. And then I can call it inside of my function, like a normal function. And now, because that last step only has 1 input value, this will work, which is what I expect. 1, 2, 3 gives 6, 1, 2, 3 gives 6, 1 and 2 gives 3. There's no numbers here, and then 1, 2, 3, 4 gives 10. So the magic, in order to get your recursive function to work, make sure that you start out with a break condition before you go further. Make sure that when you call the function recursively, you should either add 1 or -1 or whatever you want to do in order for the function to actually change. And then in order to call the function itself within itself, you need this @ sign. So yep,